Hello, my name is Ben Wissenberg. I'm a writer here at Scribbler, for lack of a better name, and I like to write novellas, novelettes, long short stories, long stuff. And I'm going to read them. I'm going to read them out for you to listen to, so that way, it doesn't impede with your day. I'm going to start with the Bashful Courtesan. I've read the prologue and the first chapter, and this is chapter 2. It takes place in 1944. Chapter 1, if you remember, took place in 1914, just before the First World War. This is 1944 in Paris, just before the liberation of Paris. Chapter 2. Here we go. I remember Gertrude Stein lived at number 7, Rue de Fleurus, a 3-minute walk to the nearby gardens of Luxembourg, where she spent the afternoons playing with her dog Basket, a standard poodle, while her friend Alice B. Talkless read a book out loud for both of them to enjoy. Gertrude would call out that she'd not heard a particular passage, and Alice would happily begin the page again. And all the while that massive dog would jump and cavort and bark and jump until Gertrude sat down under the shade of a willow and lay her head on Alice's lap, listening to Alice's reedy voice as the dog panted at her side. We lived several blocks away in a modest hotel room at the Académie Saint-Germain, which was across the street from the Université Paris, along the Rue des Saints-Pères. Gertrude was a large woman, her appearance almost masculine, far more masculine than myself. An American by birth, Gertrude liked to say she was French by adoption and Jewish on principles. But so was Alice. Jewish, I mean. Not that I had any issues with Jews. They had enough problems from all I could see. All I knew about Gertrude at the time was from what I'd read. Her family were originally German. They may have been of German descent, if not wholly German, but does it really matter in the end? I don't think so. All I know is they were part of the Nouveau Riche. Another name for social climbing Americans, I prefer to think. I've seen my share of them over the years, those social climbing Americans, and prefer to call them vulgarians, even as they insisted on calling themselves the new aristocracy. I can tell you from what I know, the aristocracy never behaved like that. Vulgarians are the kind of people who condemn the world's citizenry, the steerage class, while devouring healthy dollops of oysters Rockefeller in first-class dining rooms around the world. Looking at Gertrude, one can imagine how typically brash and American her parents must have been, so brash that it leaves you willing enough to suspend belief when Gertrude tells you her parents moved the entire household to Europe in hopes of ingraining their children with some semblance of culture. They wanted to instill the sensibilities of a European lifestyle in their children, she said. When I asked her if it worked, she paused for a moment as if thinking it over before shaking her head. It was an experiment in social climbing that ended in failure, as far as I could gather. A social disaster, according to Gertrude, who was all of 3 when her father took the entire family to Vienna. From there, the family went on to Paris. By the time she was 4, they were safely ensconced back in America, the great experiment having proven a greater failure, while they named her father director of the Market Street Railway in San Francisco. Don't ask me who they were, because I have no idea. The only thing Gertrude remembers of the family's trip was traveling with a governess for her and her sister, and tutors for her brothers. But that was when they had already returned from Europe and were once again living in America, which was why I never believed anything Gertrude said about travels with her family. I sound bitter, I know. I always do when I think about rich Americans and the grandiose schemes they all seem to have when it comes to prosperity. It's an overabundance of riches is what it is, and nothing more. It's a bitter pill for any man to have to swallow, but a taste I remember I've had to endure countless times. I've had little contact with princes, dukes, and counts over the intervening years. In fact, not since I lived in Vienna before the Great War have I had dealings with any aristos. That follows hard on a lifetime of contempt at the hands of my so-called betters. Upper-class twats they prove to be, but my betters all the same, according to the rights they cling to. They were all blue-blooded, high-born members of an upper class who only answers to Kaisers or kings, and I apologize in advance if I sometimes let my anger get the better of me. Had I stayed in Russia, there's little doubt I would have taken part in the revolution. I think Gertrude recognized that in me. Quite often, I noticed Gertrude's friend Alice walking Basket, their dog, early in the morning as I busied myself setting up my easel close to the Medici fountain. I always sat up in the gardens where I could make water sketches I later became famous for, with dew sparkling on the grass as if someone might have scattered a handful of broken glass across it, and the sky a soft, clear blue. Alice would stroll by at an unhurried pace with Basket, enjoying the warmth. Alice had always been the more feminine of the two, and sometimes paused to watch me make my quick water sketches of children at play. Some years later, I released part of my portfolio for publication, calling it exactly that, Children at Play, and it proved quite the success. You know, you'd think, being what you are, that some of the mothers might be nervous having you paint their children, Alice intoned early one morning. Oh? Why is it you think that what is it you think that I am? I asked, looking up at her from the little stool I sat on. The light was behind her, coming in through the trees where a combination of light and shadow fell across the ground around us. Playing the long-suffering, tortured soul was more in line with something I've often find myself a victim of, something that came easily to me because I didn't have to pretend, but sometimes it was wearing. Do you think it matters what I think? She laughed. No one cares what I think. It's them you have to worry about, she said, inclining her head in the direction of the children's mothers sitting perched on park benches and watching me as though I were some cautionary tale they should warn their children of. It's always them, isn't it? I said. The mothers, I mean. Do you really think I have to worry about them? Not that you have to worry about them, but if it comes right down to it, do you think you'll be able to defend yourself from an irate mother? I doubt it. You may have good intentions here, she added, as if it was an afterthought. But since when does an irate mother care about good intentions when it comes to her child? You're painting their children, and you're painting them without their permission. Or do you think your presence here makes them nervous because they can't explain you to the children? By that I mean they can't really tell them what they think you are. They can't really tell them you're an ogre, can they, like the kind in a story? That would frighten them. They'd never sleep at night knowing the monster under the bed is really the man in the park painting them as they play. No, looking at you, I can see how adversity might be defeated. Anything they have to say about you has to be in a positive light simply because they can't afford to frighten the children. I looked up at her, standing in the dappled sunlight. As I said earlier, her voice was a high, reedy pitch. She wasn't an attractive woman, not by any stretch of the imagination, and there was a hint of a mustache she did little to hide that would be a deterrent to her beauty. She was holding the dog's leash, and I looked it in the eye, sitting on the sidewalk in front of me. Your dog looks anxious, I said, in an effort to change the subject. He often is. This is Basket. I take it this is the part where I'm supposed to say something like, oh, I don't know, nice to meet you, Bandit. Basket. Basket? She nodded. I looked back up at her. There seemed to be a longing in her eyes as she watched the children as they played. She put a hand up to block the sun, and I could see there was a sad weeping of the soul behind those eyes. I thought of it as an emptiness that could only be resolved by having children of her own. I could well understand that feeling, I thought, but I could never admit to suffering from the same pain, could I? Perhaps it was the reason we both came to the gardens. It wasn't something I could ever say out loud, but, like I said, it was a sentiment I could understand. If for no other reason, then it was the same longing I felt I was missing in my own life. Too many people over the years have said I shouldn't be allowed to have children. As if being a dwarf isn't bad enough, I'm ridiculed for being misshapen, twisted and stunted, even club-footed. And I have always been looked at as insufficient and nominal. I see it in the eyes of every person I meet, man, woman, or child. There are times in your life when you believe you are what a person calls you, be it a monster or even an ogre. But Alice had never recoiled at the sight of me. She'd stand off to the side watching me make my water sketches. I made quick line drawings with a thin brush on postcard-sized pieces of paper I'd prepared the night before. I tacked them to my easel for passing parents to see. I discovered a long time ago that when a parent recognizes their child in a painting, no matter how large or small the painting, they're almost always inclined to purchase it. In preparing my postcards the night before, I'd use a wide brush and make a wash of blue sky or else a field of green dotted with daffodils. I'd let the paper dry and stiffen overnight. That way, I could paint quick sketches on a variety of backgrounds. Some backgrounds were the statue-lined walkways leading to the Medici fountain, but most were lawns, pathways, and elaborate flower beds. On the back of each postcard, I'd write my name and the name of the hotel we lived in. I always set my easel up near the Grand Basin. That's where the children raced small boats on the pond or watched puppet shows at the small outdoor theater. During those intervening years between the war, the Luxembourg was often full of people. It seemed as if the garden somehow served as a kind of sanctuary for those of us disenfranchised by the war. Or maybe we were disenfranchised by life itself. It's hard to know. Many of the men had missing arms and legs. They were shattered men with splintered lives, like my own, I told myself. And there were those, like myself, who felt as if we could reacquaint ourselves with nature, we might find that hidden truth we were all so desperately seeking. But that's a lifelong endeavor I've discovered as I've gotten older, somewhat akin to searching out the Holy Grail. There was no quick or easy solutions to life, not with everything life has to throw at you. Still, Alice approached me that first day and asked me if she might purchase several of the smaller portraits I'd made earlier. She said she was a great admirer of my work, and while I laughed as she said I wasn't a cubist or a modernist, she was hard-pressed to deny I wasn't a fauvist, not with the colors I used appearing bright and garish. She said she liked the fauvists. They're sketches, madam, I said with a note of impatience. I'm not one for drawing too much attention to my work if the person is unprepared to buy anything other than a few nominal sketches. Have you ever presented your work to the Salon d'Autonomie? I had to suppress a smile at her naivete. As you pointed out, madam, I'm not a cubist, not even close to being a modernist, and my sketches cannot be considered classical by any means. My style is my own. Fauvist or not, I am who I am, and nothing more. I make these small sketches in an effort to advertise myself. If you'd like to commission a painting, I'm at your disposal. If not, you're not only wasting your time, but mine. Good day. He's a rude little bugger, isn't he? A voice called out from behind. I hope you didn't invite him to Saturday night's salon. Pablo will eat him up. I turned at the sound of the voice and moved aside. A basket jumped up, clawing at Gertrude and barking. Alice calmed the dog down with treats she had in her pocket, then held her hand out to Gertrude to join us. Such little treasures, she commented, pointing at the water sketches. They remind me of Henri's paintings, the ones you used to have. Remember them? The colors are so bright and alive and so vivid for simple watercolors. They're just sketches, I know, but I simply must pick up 2 or 3 of these. No, Gertrude said with a slow shake of her head. No, I said, shocked by the suddenness of my condemnation. I've seen him here before. Yes, I come here quite often, I said. It's difficult to forget him once you've seen him, Gertrude replied, bending over to look at several of the sketches I'd made, yet at the same time not even acknowledging me. But it's not what we're looking for. I collect genius, she added with a firm nod as she stood up, looking down at me. Are you a genius? She asked in what I can only think of as a condescending tone. What was she asking? Was she asking me if I thought of myself as a genius? I've met a few of the genius artists she endorsed over the years, and believe me, I found their genius to be somewhat lacking. While it was flattering when Alice suggested I had a fauvist approach, the fact that Gertrude dismissed my work out of hand with no praise at all was more than damning. While Gertrude was more of a connoisseur than an art collector, a woman of her reputation could do a lot for a man's career with a single endorsement. But she might just as easily ruin a man's career with a refusal. I'd had limited success over the years while painting in Vienna, and had yet to have my breakthrough year here in Paris. Despite my flippant answer to Alice's suggestion that I present my work to the Salon d'Autonomie, I was desperate for someone to invite me to show at one of the more prestigious salons in Paris. A word from Gertrude could send me on my way. For me, I try to base all of life's paintings on what Cézanne said of himself, instead of basing it on what he almost made of himself. Do you see the difference? She asked, pointing at a sketch I'd made earlier. It was a sketch of a child on his knees launching a sailboat. She stood back a moment as if inspecting it before slowly shaking her head. Cézanne's style, his approach and belief, shows how he gave up classical elements such as pictorial arrangements, as you have here, or single-view perspectives, even outlines that enclosed colors in an attempt to get a living perspective by capturing all the complexities the eye observes. Do you understand what I mean by that? I shook my head. He wanted us to see and to sense the object he was painting rather than thinking about it. Ultimately, what he wanted was to find a point where sight was also touch. He'd take hours putting down a single brushstroke because each stroke, he said, needed to contain the air and the light and the object of the composition, the character, the outline, the essence, the style. A still life could take him 100 working sessions, while a portrait would take him around 150 sessions. Cézanne believed that while he was painting, he was capturing a moment in time, and once it was past, it could never come back again. The atmosphere surrounding what he was painting was a part of the sensational reality he was painting. He always said that art is a personal appreciation, which he embodied in sensations and asked the understanding to organize it into a painting. When he couldn't make something work, he left it for us to figure out, thus creating an enigma about himself. He insisted on showing us his inability and tried to share his lack of success by showing us what he couldn't do. It had almost become an obsession for him. This is an obvious result of that affluence. But you haven't even seen any of his work, Alice said, the dismay obvious in her voice. I don't need to. You're basing what I do on the work of your so-called protégé, I asked. Not my protégé. I'm far too young for that, she said with a deep sigh. He was simply someone I admired, someone we all admired. And when you say all, you mean you and your friends. He wasn't someone I admired. It was incredulous. It was a prejudice so out of hand and so damning, it almost left me speechless. How can you dismiss my work or think I've let myself be influenced by a man whose work I don't even know? It's ludicrous. People who find themselves influenced by him find themselves obsessed by things they don't understand, and so they use his influence as a system of camouflage, she said, pointing at the many sketches I'd made throughout the morning. I heard that in Canada there's a group of men treating the Canadian frontier to a familiar Fauvist palette. It's only natural for something like that, I suppose, and it may even be inevitable. I mean, Canada's a big country, she went on, but those men were here during the war. It's obvious they were influenced by everything they witnessed without even realizing it, and took what they learned here and applied it to their own great wilderness there. Van Gogh used to paint scenes in the countryside. Matisse tried concealing his genius as best he could, and yet, all the while, Cézanne didn't even realize what he had right in front of him. Picasso conceals his genius in his cubist fashion. But that's his genius, isn't it? The one man who wanted to emulate Cézanne through his difficult time was Gris, the Spaniard. Do you know him? Are you familiar with his work? I shook my head. And what difficult time are you referring to? They were the forerunners of the Cubist movement. They weren't Impressionists like Monet and Degas, but Neo-Impressionists. Although there's no doubt they were influenced by the Impressionists, but it was a natural evolution that they'd take up to another level. Gris persisted to that end after Cézanne died, deepening things Cézanne wanted to do. But the task proved too much to him, and it ended up killing him. His heart, they said. So now, here we are, having come almost full circle, with these hideous little postcard-sized bites being sold at 2 francs apiece. You're a painter who follows the status quo, which is what Cézanne couldn't do. and you attack things he tried to make by creating objects which have to exist. I mean, for and of themselves, not in relation to what he saw around him. You have no mind for genius. I couldn't understand anything she had to say and shook my head. The names meant little to me, but aside from that, I found her ideas brazen. You don't know me, and you don't know my work. You know nothing about me, and yet you've already formed an opinion. You say my work resembles a man I don't know, and you dismiss what I do out of hand because you say it reminds you of him. I believe you see me as nothing more than a freak, madam, a dwarf first, and you can't wrap your mind around the fact that someone like myself might have talent. Am I less a man than any man you know, because I'm an aberration of nature? I suppose it matters nothing to you that I've been dealing with the same attitude my entire life. Why would it? But the fact you're willing to dismiss me and my work based on my appearance is inexcusable. The little man with the little pictures painting in the park, I said, mimicking her gruff voice as I cleaned up my workstation, dropping my bucket brushes into a small jar of water I had. When I think how people look at you as the cultural barometer of Paris and call you a social icon, I shake my head in wonder. No, not in wonder, but in disbelief. Yes, that's it. But what do you know about art? Nothing from what I can see. Your brother was the one who had the eye for it, the only one who had any talent for it. Still, the critics turn to you and ask you which way the culture of France is leaning, and what do? You point the country at whatever direction appeals to you, at someone you say who inspires you, and then you call it genius and dismiss everything else. You are divisive, madam. That's not true. You don't know her, Alice exclaimed, and you defend her. Willingly. Gertrude had no desire to stay, and so moved along, whistling for the dog who came running after her, barking and dragging his leash behind. Alice looked at me in shock before turning away and hastening after her friend. I watched the two of them making their way up the path, and as they did, made a quick sketch, hoping to capture the embodiment of what I thought was a self-imposed isolation. The dog was central to the whole thing, I told myself. It was only natural. Alice was leaning in while Gertrude appeared to be drawing back, looking at her with her short, mannish hairstyle. 7 quick brushstrokes of dark blue for the one, a dozen gray for the other, and a splash of color for the dog dancing between them was all it took to complete the sketch. I liked it so much I decided to do another, and before I knew it, I had 4 quick sketches I hoped would become a painting in time. I sketched in several of the statues lining the way, offering a glance at the Medici fountain in the distance. The trees I made were simple green blotches of water over the faintest of blue skies, and the 2 colors blended together while I painted the tree trunks with savage downward strokes. It would become one of my better-known paintings, Les Demoiselles et le Chien dans le Jardin de Luxembourg, Paris, 1931. People called it The Dog in the Gardens of the Luxembourg after seeing it reprinted in an American magazine. It was part of an article about Gertrude's influence on the Parisian culture. That was back in 1935. Gertrude and Alice were on an extended book tour in America promoting the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. Gertrude's first and only success as a writer, I'd never see them again. Gertrude's sudden worldwide fame vaulted her into the limelight, just as it did for me, and while she was quick to take advantage, I hid from it. Later, when she returned to France, just as the war broke out, she slipped out of Paris before the Germans arrived. She'd lost her lease at the number 27 Rue de Fleurs, and I heard they'd moved out to a country home in Vichy, which they also lost. After that, I lost all track of her and never knew where she went. I assumed she'd left for England, though there were stories, as well as allegations, that they were still in Vichy, living under the protective influence of friends. As 2 American Jews living in Paris, they'd be subject to strict anti-Semitic laws. In Vichy, France, they'd be free to pursue their avant-garde lifestyle without fear. After the war, there were some who said their friends their friends protecting her were Nazi sympathizers, collaborators, who were knowingly preventing her from the Gestapo and the horrors of the camps. It may have been as simple as her being a now famous American writer. Paris, as a city, is more than breathtaking. As an ideal, it's imposing. It has the distinction of being both a romantic inspiration as well as being the destination of artists for hundreds of years. The city's architecture often renders the visitor speechless. The lanes are narrow, but on purpose, in hopes of making it difficult for armies to worm their way through the maze of twisted streets, while the boulevards are wide and spacious. I suppose that allows the average Parisian an opportunity to come out and wave their troops off to battle, or maybe welcome them back victorious, except that that's never happened, has it? The irony of it all is that ever since they gutted the old city and its walls, Paris has never borne witness to a victorious army. The only warfare that's ever echoed through the streets of Paris over the last 100 years has been class warfare. Did you know it was the Industrial Revolution that gave us the word sabotage? That was when fed-up workers threw their wooden sabots into the cogs of machines in protest. And then there were all those stories in French literature. I've always been an avid reader, and so is Courtesan, who has become quite proficient with Braille. But I enjoy Paris. I ask you, what is there not to like about Paris? Since the Germans arrived 4 years ago, traffic in the city has all but come to a standstill. Well, except for the military transports. There were always heavy trucks lumbering through the twisting streets while an eerie silence hangs over the city, which I now find mesmerizing. I search for the unfamiliar now, such as the sounds of bird song, or maybe the wind whistling through the trees. I remember sitting on a park bench one afternoon and counting less than 3 dozen civilian cars within the space of an hour. 10 years ago, that number would have been in the thousands. And just as I did 10 years ago, I enjoyed watching the sun hit the cobblestone streets, the early morning light reflecting off the stones, and just for that one moment, however brief, I watched the morning dew steaming off the stones. The only difference between now and 10 years ago is that the baker no longer opens his doors, letting the streets fill with the smell of fresh baked breads. I often find myself in a world full of lost memories that flood my senses and make me wax nostalgic. A sentiment I wish I could share with someone. I once tried describing everything I saw to Constanza shortly after we'd first arrived. It proved too much for both of us. As I tried describing things to her, I thought to myself, I could have just as easily done it with a sketch. How does one go about describing the wonders of a city such as Paris? No, I thought, it would be better for her to get a feel of the place on her own terms. I'd take her out for a brisk walk, early morning walks, letting her stop for as long as she needed, even if it was to inhale the soft-scented flowers filling a warm breeze that drifted toward us from the Jardin de Luxembourg. With me at her side to distract her from those moments when she thought of the scars running down her cheeks, I thought she might discover a new love for the city. Over the years, I've never allowed her the chance to withdraw into herself, building a cocoon of misery and wrapping it around herself because the world around her changed. Once she strolled the streets of Vienna with a parasol hanging from one arm and a lover on the other. Now she uses a cane to tap out a path in front of her while holding my tiny hand in hers. She's proven herself as masterful with the cane as she is adept at crossing the streets around the Rue de Saint-Pierre. I sometimes think it's as if she's been living in the city her entire life. She's become a familiar sight to the people, endearing herself to everyone with her warm and happy disposition, and they watch out for her as a result, smiling when she barters with the butcher and the baker in her broken French. Her desire to explore the streets would give me the time I needed to think about my long walk out to the Jeu de Paume. One thing I've been wondering about lately is why Etienne Archambault has been following me for the past several days. When the Germans first invaded, Allied General Staff begged the French government to defend Paris, street by street if they had to, something Marshal Pétain dismissed as a foolish plan. I freely admit I had to agree with him at the time. There was nothing to gain in making Paris a city of ruins, and the old Marshal said, and again, I had to agree with him. Destroying Paris wouldn't affect the outcome of the war, would it? No. But if the Allies had had it their way, Paris would still be in German hands and probably a city of rubble. So, on June 12th, defying the pleas of Allied General Staff, the French government, which had by now relocated to Tours, declared Paris an open city and announced there would be no resistance. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of June 14, 1940, German troops entered the city by the Porte de Villette, traveling along the Rue de Flanders toward the city center. A strange silence fell across the city. Several columns of German military vehicles with loudspeakers instructed us not to leave our homes, and really, why would we? Did they expect us to come out with flags waving, watching the only army to ever march through the wide boulevards of Paris? At 8 o'clock that same morning, delegates of the German army arrived at the headquarters of the military governor and the prefecture of police. The Germans politely invited the officials to put themselves at the disposal of their German occupiers. By the end of the afternoon, swastika flags were flying at the Arc de Triomphe, and a military parade, complete with marching band, was marching along the Champs-Élysées and the Avenue Foch. I'm told it was for the benefit of German army photographers and newsreel cameras, but like so many other Parisians, I hid in our little apartment and wept. By the evening of 16 June, Prime Minister Reynaud had resigned. The following morning, General de Gaulle left Bordeaux by plane, bound for London. By midday, Parisians gathered around their radios and listened as Marshal Pétain accepted full responsibility in his role as the new head of the French government. His first announcement was that the fighting must stop. Though no armistice was signed, the French army stopped fighting. I hold no ill will toward the regular German soldier. I hold no ill will toward any man. Mine has been a life filled with prejudice and hatred aimed at me from early childhood. It mattered little whether that man was Russian, Austrian, Hungarian, French, or German. While I admit it might be understandable for a man to harbor a deep-seated hatred for any transgressions against him, there can be no satisfying end in this for me. Do you think any of my feelings had to do with me being a weak-minded man? I try not to think like that. Am I weak-willed? Have I ever been weak-willed? I've been beaten down my entire life, so how would I know any other way? The priests made certain to explain that I was being punished as a spawn of the devil, and they were just as quick to shun my mother for having given birth to such an abomination. Still, I was raised to believe in forgiveness and to forgive all men their sins, even priests. I told myself I wouldn't allow myself to be used as a pawn by either the resistance or any German I knew who had his own agenda. I say this because of my manner for surviving this ordeal. Obersturmführer Gerhard Eisner claimed he was never an active member of the Nazi Party, whatever that's supposed to mean, but then again, I'm almost certain he felt he was more than just my taskmaster. If you were to ask him, I'm sure he'd tell you he was my savior, and that's why there was never any remorse on his part in asking me to complete the tasks he required of me. But he was neither a savior nor my taskmaster, in my opinion. Like every other German officer in Paris, he seemed to have his own identity, his own idea of what his country owed him. As far as he was concerned, the war owed him his career. It was as simple as that. He wasn't a volunteer, he said. They drafted him. And because they drafted him, he'd lost everything. He was not what you might call a big fan of the war, but he set about making the most of the situation he found himself in. When he discovered where his talents might take him, he used me to his advantage. There's only the one photograph of him that I'm aware of, taken shortly after the Germans surrendered in Paris. He's seated on the floor among a group of officers and other general staff, but he's only partially visible and appears almost solitary, reclusive even, staring at a spot on the wall in front of him that only he can see. A short, round, bespectacled man of 28, wearing a soldier's cap rather than an officer's hat. Perhaps he was thinking such a simple ruse would serve to confuse his captors. I don't know. He told me he once worked at the Académie de Kunst de Paris, Platz, before the war. The Berlin Academy was the third such academy built in Europe. It had been built by the Prussian King Frederick I, in the same spirit as the Academy at Rome and here in Paris. And while Eisner had always been quick to claim he was an art historian and never an active member of the Nazi Party, one has to remember they all denied being active members of the party after the war, didn't they? Accordingly, no one was really a member of the party, and it was something they did to survive. Eisner said his reason for joining the party was because they wouldn't allow him to work otherwise. Not exactly a viable excuse, but he didn't hesitate telling me his story whenever the opportunity presented itself. God knows there was little else for us to talk about. The only thing that mattered to me was that he had access to food as a Nazi officer, while the population around us slowly starved. He brought food out for us as a reward, as well as an incentive for me to use my talents, and my talents were many, I discovered. But as I said earlier, the question that remained uppermost in my mind was why Etienne Archambault, probably a member of the French resistance, had been following me home every night. It's possible he may have had business with Eisner, who was one of several members of the Reichsleiter Rosenberg Task Force, the ERR, the men responsible for packing, crating, and loading artwork into boxcars bound for Berlin. There you go. I'm sorry I stuttered. I stumbled a few times, but, this is just a one-off, a one take. I can't, I can't go back. I can't go back to the beginning and start over again because it's this is long. It's a half an hour reading, so I'd have to start all over again, and it's getting late. Wife's on the way home and all that stuff like that. Anyways, I'm putting this up on my BookTube channel. I'm putting in a link to my Substack page. So my Substack readers can come and look at it, and you can look at my Substack. And you can read different stories there. You can read the story in its entirety on Substack, whatever you wish to do. And I'm going to call it a day at that and try and keep this short and sweet and to the point. So I'll see you next week. I'll try to sit it proper. I'll try to approach everything proper and be good. And I'll see you later. Oh, yeah, and by the way, it's my birthday on Monday. Happy birthday to me. Okay, bye.